I never noticed how quiet the mornings had become. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, but presses against your chest, reminding you that the air is too still. I stood barefoot on the cold kitchen tiles, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly, watching the cream spiral like smoke. My robe clung to the dampness of my skin, thin enough to feel the slight chill of the early seaside air seeping through the windows. I wore lace underneath. Not for anyone. Not even for myself, really. But sometimes I needed to remember I still could. My husband had left for his morning run. He always left early, predictable to the minute, his sneakers hitting the gravel path with the same rhythm he used to plan our weekends. He'd kiss me on the forehead, always the forehead, before stepping out, and I'd nod, eyes half closed, pretending I was still asleep. Routine had replaced intimacy, not out of malice or disinterest, but because over the years, comfort had pushed desire into a quiet corner of the room. Upstairs, his son was still asleep. He'd arrived the night before, with one suitcase and a camera bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't a boy anymore. I saw it immediately, though I wasn't sure how to process that recognition. His presence unsettled something in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Not attraction, not yet. Just awareness. I had almost forgotten what it meant to be aware of another body in the room. We hadn't seen each other for years. He had grown up mostly with his mother and only visited occasionally. But this summer, he was staying longer. A break from the city, his father said. Fresh air, quiet, the sea. It'll be good for him, he had added, as if his son were an aging relative needing rest. He came downstairs around 9, still adjusting to the light. Hair tousled, eyes puffy from sleep, but his voice was calm, lower than I remembered. He said good morning and poured himself coffee, not waiting for me to offer. That, too, surprised me. He wasn't a guest. Not exactly. There was something casual, almost intimate, in how easily he moved in our kitchen. "You always make it look like a magazine," he said, gesturing to the breakfast setup. I had laid out croissants, fruit, and cheese, more from habit than effort. "I like pretty things," I replied, careful to keep my tone light. He smiled faintly. "I can tell." That smile lingered, not on his face, but in the air between us, as though it refused to disappear completely. We didn't talk much after that. My husband returned, sweaty and winded, kissed me quickly on the cheek, and disappeared upstairs to shower. We resumed the rhythm. Breakfast, news, emails. But I noticed something new in the silence. Not absence, tension. The day passed in fragments. He worked on his photos, editing quietly in the sunroom, earphones in. I moved through the house like a ghost, dusting what didn't need dusting, opening windows that were already open. I wasn't restless. I was expectant, though I couldn't say what I was waiting for. In the late afternoon, we were left alone again. My husband had locked himself in the study for calls, and I found myself in the kitchen, slicing limes for water, trying not to wonder whether the robe I wore felt too thin now. He entered without warning, carrying a book he had found on the shelf. "This yours?" he asked, holding it out. I nodded, watching his fingers on the spine. "It was a gift, years ago." He flipped it open. "You've underlined a lot. I like rereading things I don't fully understand." He looked at me for a long moment before placing the book down. Most people just stop reading them. His eyes weren't intrusive, but they were observant. There was no flirtation, no posturing. Just an intensity that made me feel like he was seeing something I had forgotten was visible. I turned away, unsure of why I suddenly felt exposed. That evening, we ate on the terrace. The breeze lifted the hem of my dress now and then, reminding me of skin. My husband opened a bottle of wine, distracted by work, by his own thoughts, barely present. The conversation circled around the mundane. My mind didn't. At one point, I glanced at him. His son, and he was already looking at me. Not with hunger, not even curiosity, just a stillness, like he had been listening to my silence all day. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned orange, my husband stood to answer a call inside. We were left alone again, and I felt the air shift. Not dangerously, just undeniably. He broke the silence. "You always wanted to live by the water?" I nodded. "Since I was a child. It makes me feel less trapped." He tilted his head. "You feel trapped here?" The question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even curious. It was reflective, like he was asking himself the same thing. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, my husband returned, phone in hand. "They want me in Boston. 2 days, maybe 3. He said casually. "I thought about taking you with me, but you'd probably be bored. You're okay staying here?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. "Yes," I said finally, my voice quiet. "It's fine." He glanced at his son. "Good. You'll keep her company." I smiled, but something inside me had already stopped pretending. I went to bed that night wearing the same lace I had put on that morning. Not because I was waiting for anything, but because now I couldn't pretend I wasn't. The silence of the morning felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just aware of itself. As if the house had learned to listen. I moved slowly through the kitchen, the tiled floor warm from the sun, and I didn't bother with a robe this time. A cotton slip, pale blue and nearly weightless, was enough. I let the fabric brush against my thighs as I poured coffee, hearing nothing but the occasional creak of the ceiling above. He was awake, or almost. I lingered longer than necessary at the counter. I noticed myself doing things I hadn't done in years, checking my reflection in the microwave door, adjusting a shoulder strap that didn't need adjusting. There was no audience, and yet I felt watched. Not in the way that demands attention, but in the way that changes your posture even when no one's looking. He came down barefoot, shirtless, his hair still wet from the shower. A towel hung over his shoulder, and he looked for a moment like someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. He mumbled a greeting and reached for a glass of water. The kitchen suddenly seemed too small, the space between us too narrow. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, existing in a way that made my breath shallow. We didn't talk, but the air between us had weight. When he brushed past me to reach the sink, I felt it. His skin didn't touch mine, but it may as well have. I felt heat. Not his body's, but my own. A sudden flood under my skin. I stepped back, pretending to check the fridge. My fingers trembled slightly as I held the handle. The day unfolded with deceptive ease. My husband had left early, leaving a note on the kitchen island and a kiss on my temple before disappearing. I didn't remember the kiss. I only remembered the note. "Don't forget to water the plants." It felt strange that the only trace of him that morning was about something so lifeless. He, the sun, spent the morning editing photos again. I passed by the room where he worked, pausing at the door, watching him through the sliver of space. His face was lit by the screen, eyes focused, lips slightly parted. He hadn't noticed me. Or maybe he had and didn't show it. I walked away before he could look up. In the early afternoon, I went out to the garden with a book I didn't plan to read. I let my dress fall loosely around my legs, the sun tracing the shape of my knees. He joined me, wordlessly, sitting a few chairs away. We didn't speak. The silence now was no longer hesitant. It had become its own language. Every glance, every shift in his seat, every sip of his drink was a sentence neither of us dared to speak aloud. I could feel it building. Not like a storm, but like a tide. Rising quietly, persistently, ignoring all my logic. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that this wasn't what it felt like, that I was inventing tension out of boredom. But my body knew better. It was already betraying me. Around 5, clouds gathered and we moved inside. The air had turned humid, and I could feel my skin damp against the fabric of my dress. I went upstairs to change, pausing in front of the mirror. I removed the slip and stared at my reflection for too long. I chose a different dress. Silk, deeper neckline, the kind I wore for dinners we rarely had anymore. And under it, nothing. Not out of provocation, but because I wanted to feel alive against the fabric. When I returned, he was in the kitchen again, looking for something in the pantry. I moved past him to reach a glass, and his hand grazed my elbow. It could have been accidental. Should have been. But I paused, just for a second, and that second was enough. Our eyes met. Neither of us moved. And then we both did, but in opposite directions. I told myself I needed wine. I opened a bottle, poured 2 glasses, and handed him one. He took it. No questions. No comments. We sat at the edge of the terrace, the rain beginning to fall in thin lines. Not heavy, not cold, just present. Like everything else that day. He looked at me then, not like a son looks at a stepmother, and not like a man looks at a woman he plans to touch. He looked at me as if he knew I wouldn't stop him if he did. "You always like this kind of weather?" he asked, voice low. "Only when I don't have to pretend to enjoy it." He held my gaze. "You pretend a lot?" I took a sip. More than I'd like. There was no music, no thunder, no cinematic moment, just the sound of rain and the space between us getting smaller. He didn't lean in. I did. Or maybe it was mutual. Maybe no one moved. Maybe we just stopped holding back. The kiss wasn't soft. It wasn't wild either. It was inevitable. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission because it already knows the answer. I felt his hand on my waist, steady, not demanding. And for a second, I forgot everything else. My name, my age, my house, my marriage. When I pulled away, I didn't look at him. I stood, walked inside, and left my glass on the counter. My heart was thudding in my chest, not from guilt, but from clarity. I had crossed something, a boundary, a threshold I didn't know existed until it disappeared under my feet. I went upstairs and lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. The house felt changed, rearranged in a way I couldn't undo. My skin still remembered him. My mouth still tasted of wine and rain. I told myself it was nothing, that it wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I had already started counting the hours until we would be alone again. The morning arrived late, wrapped of a soft gray light that clung to the curtains and refused to let the sun fully in. I stayed in bed longer than usual, my body still tense beneath the sheets, though I hadn't moved in hours. Every breath felt shallow, like I was afraid a deeper one might pull yesterday back into the room. But it never truly left. It lingered on my skin, in the taste of my mouth, in the silence between the floorboards. I showered without urgency. The water ran hotter than necessary, steaming the mirror until I could barely see my own reflection. It felt appropriate. I didn't want to look at myself. I didn't want to acknowledge the change. And yet, every time the water hit a certain place on my body, my mind betrayed me. Revisiting the moment on the terrace like a loop I didn't know how to stop. After dressing, I opened the drawer and paused. The choice of underwear shouldn't matter, but it did. I ran my fingers over cotton, silk, lace, each one saying something I didn't want to admit. Eventually, I chose a nude set, almost imperceptible, soft to the touch, the kind that made you feel aware of your own skin rather than the fabric itself. It wasn't for anyone. That lie was already wearing thin. Downstairs, my husband had returned. He stood in the kitchen, shirt slightly wrinkled, reading glasses perched on his nose as he scrolled through his phone. He looked up and smiled, the kind of habitual smile shared between people who've forgotten to see each other. I returned it with equal softness. We exchanged pleasantries, brief and polished, like we were on autopilot. He asked if I slept well. I said I did. He didn't notice the stiffness in my shoulders or the way my hand tightened slightly around my coffee mug. Then his son entered, and the world shifted half a degree. His presence was quieter now, heavier. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made it impossible not to give it. He greeted us both with a calm nod and sat across the island. I didn't look directly at him, but I felt the moment his eyes landed on me. It wasn't deliberate. It was instinctual. My skin responded before my mind did. Breakfast passed in polite conversation. My husband recounted details from his trip, meetings, and delays as though they mattered. I nodded in all the right places, asked the appropriate questions, offered smiles. But all the while, I was hyper-aware of every shift in the room. The way the light caught his son's profile. The way his fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of the stool. The way my own knees felt too exposed beneath the hem of my dress. Later, as my husband retreated into his office for calls, I began clearing the dishes. He stayed behind, helping in silence. It wasn't necessary. He knew it. I knew it. But the proximity was unbearable in its simplicity. At one point, I turned to rinse a plate, and he was close. Too close. His arm brushed mine, barely, but the contact sent a jolt through my ribs. I inhaled sharply, controlled it, and continued as if it hadn't happened. He didn't apologize. He didn't move away. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange haze. My husband's voice echoed through the hallway as he handled work. I wandered aimlessly through the house, touching surfaces, fluffing pillows that didn't need it, rearranging objects for no reason. Everything felt off balance. The walls were too narrow, the rooms too silent. My body felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to the woman I had been 2 days ago. Sometime near dusk, I went to the garden. The air was heavier than before, thick with the scent of salt and leaves. I sat alone, arms folded around my knees, trying to quiet my mind. It didn't work. Every thought returned to that kiss, to how easily I had given into it, and to how badly I wanted to feel that again. Not the kiss, but the feeling of not being numb. He joined me eventually, stepping through the back door with a book in hand. He didn't sit next to me. He chose the other bench, diagonal, still visible in my periphery. The gesture was considerate, or strategic. I wasn't sure. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat with the weight of everything that hadn't been said. Then he broke the silence, his voice low. "You seem different." I didn't turn to face him. Everyone seems different when you watch them long enough. "You think I've been watching you?" I didn't answer. After a pause, he added, "I notice things. Always have. That's why I take pictures, I guess." "What did you notice about me?" I asked before I could stop myself. Another silence. Then, "That you only touch your necklace when you're trying not to say something." I looked down. My fingers were at my throat, playing with the chain I hadn't taken off in years. We didn't say more after that. The moment was already stretched too far. We stayed outside until the sky faded to ink and only the hum of insects remained. Later that night, after we had all eaten and my husband had gone upstairs, I passed by the bathroom. The door was open slightly, steam curling out into the hallway. I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. Wet hair, towel around his waist, the curve of his shoulder as he turned toward the door. I should have kept walking. I should have closed my eyes. But I didn't. I stood there for a second too long. And in that second, he saw me. He didn't flinch, didn't cover himself. He simply looked at me, chest rising and falling slowly, waiting. I couldn't read his expression. It wasn't smug. It wasn't daring. It was something far more dangerous. Accepting. As if whatever I chose to do next, he would let it happen. I walked away. My heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to escape. In bed, my husband turned toward me in the dark. He placed a hand on my hip, gentle, familiar. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in. I just lay there, counting the seconds between each of his breaths, waiting for mine to slow down. But they didn't. Because across the hallway, someone else was awake. And I knew, without a doubt, that he was waiting for something too. The idea of the trip came the next morning, served casually over breakfast with coffee and 2 slices of buttered toast. He mentioned it as if it were spontaneous, but I knew him too well. My husband didn't do spontaneous. Every plan had subtext, and this one felt like a carefully timed move on a board I didn't know we were playing. A small coastal town just 40 minutes away, with a Sunday market, vineyards, and quiet beaches. He suggested we go together, all 3 of us. "We've been cooped up too long," he said, glancing between us. "It'll be good to get out." The son said yes immediately, with a simple nod, and for a moment I wondered whether he understood the game too. Or maybe I was the only one who saw it as a game. I looked at my husband's face, earnest, hopeful, maybe even oblivious, and then at the son's, calm, unreadable. I said yes last. Not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't trust myself not to. The drive began quietly. I sat in the passenger seat, my husband behind the wheel, his son in the back. The sun stretched long shadows across the dashboard, and the air conditioning hummed steadily, filling the silence neither of them seemed eager to break. I stared out the window, focusing on the flicker of trees, the rise and fall of the road, anything but the reflection in the side mirror that kept catching his eyes. We stopped first at the vineyards. It was warm, breezy, the kind of day made for postcards. Tourists wandered the grounds in pairs, sipping wine from delicate glasses, laughing in tones too bright to be real. My husband took charge, guiding us toward the tasting tables, launching into polite conversation with a staff member who recognized him from a previous visit. I followed, smiling when expected, nodding through the same stories I'd heard before. But I could feel the sun's presence behind me, like a second pulse. He wasn't close, not physically, but I felt him watching. Me, the way I stood, the way I tilted my head as I tasted the wine. There was something careful in the way he kept his distance, almost too careful. We sat on the terrace afterward, the 3 of us around a small table with a view of the valley. My husband was recounting a memory from when his son was 10, something about a camping trip and a stolen bag of marshmallows. I laughed where I should have, but my eyes wandered. The son sat still, half turned toward the hills, one finger tracing the rim of his empty glass. There was tension in his posture, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. When our eyes met, it was brief but pointed, like both of us had heard something that hadn't been said aloud. The next stop was the beach. A hidden cove, my husband had called it, down a sloping path through wild grass. He parked at the top of the trail and handed me a water bottle. "You okay walking?" he asked. I nodded. My legs felt unsteady, but not from the terrain. We made our way down slowly. At the bottom, the beach opened like a secret. Wide, nearly empty, waves breaking gently on soft sand. I kicked off my shoes and let the water reach my ankles. It was cold, refreshing. The kind of cold that reminded you that you still had nerves to feel with. At some point, my husband wandered off toward a rocky outcrop, camera in hand. He was a collector of moments, but always from a distance. He liked capturing scenes he wasn't part of. That left the 2 of us alone. He didn't speak. He walked beside me, hands in pockets, head slightly bowed. The space between us felt like a held breath, neither of us willing to release it. I glanced at him, noticing again how adult he looked. Not just in body, but in presence. He wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't trying at all, and that made everything worse. I asked him if he liked the sea. He nodded, said it felt real, not like the city. I asked if he missed the city. He shook his head. I didn't ask anything else. The quiet between us wasn't absence. It was weight. It grew heavier with each wave, with each accidental brush of his arm against mine as we walked along the shore. At one point, I sat down on a flat rock, letting the sun dry the salt on my skin. He remained standing a few feet away, staring out at the water. "I didn't think it would be like this," I said finally. He turned. "What?" "This. Us." He didn't respond right away, just watched me for a long moment before sitting beside me. "I didn't plan anything," he said, voice low. "I know. I didn't mean for it to happen. I know. But it did." There were no follow-up questions, no reassurances, just that. A mutual confession without defense. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. Everything between us had already shifted. We sat there side by side, close enough for our arms to graze when the wind moved the right way. On the drive back, the silence was louder. My husband hummed along with the radio, oblivious or pretending to be. The sun leaned against the window, eyes closed, but I could tell he wasn't asleep. His jaw was tight, like someone biting back a scream. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Back at home, the sky had darkened. My head ached. An easy excuse. When my husband suggested going out for dinner, I declined. Said I needed to lie down. He offered to stay, but I told him to go alone. Said the sea air had worn me out. He hesitated, then left. As soon as I heard the car door shut and the engine fade down the street, I sat up. My skin tingled with something that wasn't fear and wasn't desire. It was closer to inevitability. I went to the bathroom, ran cold water over my wrists, stared at my reflection in the mirror. My cheeks were flushed, though I hadn't spoken in nearly half an hour. A soft knock on the door. No words, just a single tentative knock. I opened it. He stood there, not leaning in, not stepping forward. Just standing. We didn't smile. We didn't speak. I moved aside. He walked in, and for a moment, everything in the house, every object, every photo on the wall, every memory tied to that place, fell silent. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered but the fact that I hadn't said no. He didn't stay long that night. The moment was quiet, almost reverent, as if even the walls of the room understood the delicacy of our presence together. He stood near the window for a while, not touching anything, not even looking directly at me. I sat on the edge of the bed, not moving, not speaking, not sure whether I wanted to reach out or run away. Eventually, he said he was going back to the guest room. His voice was steady, respectful. I only nodded. It felt safer to pretend it hadn't been a choice. On either of our parts. I didn't sleep. I stared into the dark, listening for every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the trees, the occasional hum of a passing car. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to still. Images flashed behind my closed eyelids. His mouth, the way his hand had almost touched mine before he caught himself. The look in his eyes when he stepped away. There was restraint in him that unnerved me more than anything else. He didn't chase, didn't push, didn't even ask. And somehow, that made everything more dangerous. The morning passed with strange calmness. I made breakfast out of habit. Eggs, toast, black coffee. Without appetite or awareness. My husband returned just after noon. He kissed my cheek, set a bag of groceries on the counter, and told me about the small seafood place he'd discovered, the one with the mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. I smiled in all the right places, nodding at his stories. But a part of me wasn't in that kitchen anymore. Later, he suggested we all take a short trip the following day, one night just outside the city. A change of pace, he called it. I asked where. He mentioned a small inn by the bay, a place we had once visited years ago before we were married. I remembered the scent of salt and old wood, the uneven floorboards in the hallway, the soft linens that always smelled like lavender and sea air. I remembered falling asleep to the sound of waves and his breathing beside me. It had been a different time then. I wasn't sure I could go back to that place without feeling like a stranger in my own life. But I said yes. Again. The drive there was uneventful. Conversation circled around mundane things. Road conditions, weather, a song on the radio that reminded him of college. I watched the road wind past, the trees blurring into green shadows. Occasionally, I'd glance at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't look back. He stared out the window, one earbud in, expression unreadable. The inn hadn't changed. The paint was still faded in the same places, the porch still creaked underfoot, and the receptionist still wore her graying hair in the same tight bun I remembered. We were given 2 rooms, adjacent with a shared balcony. My husband smiled at the coincidence. "Like old times," he said. I excused myself early in the evening, claiming a headache. The truth wasn't far off. My mind had become a battlefield of tension and memory. I changed into something loose, soft. A linen robe over fresh skin, bare underneath. I opened the balcony door and stepped outside, letting the night air cool my arms. Below, the sea murmured its old lullaby, and I leaned on the railing, staring into the darkness. I didn't expect him to come out. But when he did, I didn't turn to look. He stood a few feet away, leaning on the same railing, mirroring me. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, intimate in its depth. The sounds of the sea, of insects chirping, of distant wind chimes from the porch below. All of it blurred into one soft hum. Then, barely audible, I thought about leaving. I didn't answer. He continued. After that night, after I crossed a line. Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to make things worse or harder. "They're already both," I said, almost whispering. His head turned. "Then why didn't you stop me?" I closed my eyes. "Because I didn't want to." He moved closer then. Not rushed. Measured. Respectful. Every step heavy with decision. His hand rested lightly on the railing beside mine, fingers not touching, but close enough that I could feel their warmth. I turned, slowly, and our eyes met in the faint moonlight. The kiss this time was different. It wasn't shy or accidental. It wasn't a question. It was a confession. Quiet, deep, aching. His hands didn't roam. They settled at my waist, firm and trembling. I felt the press of his chest against mine, the rhythm of his breath, the way his mouth found mine with something between restraint and hunger. It lasted only a few seconds, but it shifted everything again. Not forward, not backward, just deeper. Like roots twisting further into earth you thought was solid. I pulled away first, breath caught in my throat. I turned and walked back into the room without a word, closing the balcony door gently behind me. My legs were unsteady, my pulse erratic. I stood in the dark, hand on the doorknob, waiting to feel something that resembled clarity. It didn't come. Instead, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from my husband. Meeting moved up. "I'll head back early tomorrow. You can stay and relax." I stared at the words, at the simplicity of them. He was leaving us alone again. I sat on the bed, robe still loose, the night still pressing in from outside. I could hear footsteps on the balcony, retreating. A soft knock at the adjoining door. Then his voice, quiet, careful. "Come with me, just for a day. Somewhere else." I didn't answer. Not right away, because in that moment I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a stepmother. I wasn't even myself. I was just someone standing at the edge of something irreversible. The following morning unfolded slowly, with the kind of stillness that feels orchestrated. Light spilled in through the slats of the blinds, casting thin golden lines across the floor. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, robe pulled tightly around me, as if the fabric could contain the heat still lingering beneath my skin. The night hadn't faded. It clung to me like a second layer of flesh. Every glance, every movement, every breath from the hours before still echoed beneath the surface. My husband left early. The goodbye was brief, distracted. He had a call to take, a bag already in hand and a mind half out the door. He kissed my forehead as always and told me to rest, to stay another night if I needed it. "You could use the quiet," he said. I didn't argue. I didn't offer to pack. I didn't even ask where exactly he was going. He disappeared with the same ease as mist dissolving into morning. I stood at the balcony after he left, watching the parking lot below. His car pulled out onto the road, turned once, and vanished behind the line of trees. For a few moments, I listened for the sound of tires on gravel, refusing to accept that I was now alone with the silence. And him. Inside, I changed slowly. Not with seduction in mind. Not this time. There was no anticipation, no plan. I chose a cotton dress, long and fitted, soft against the skin. It was old, comfortable, something I hadn't worn in years. The kind of garment that felt more like a memory than an outfit. No makeup, no jewelry. I didn't want to signal anything. Not to him, not to myself. I opened the connecting door cautiously. The room beyond was dim, curtains still drawn. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, looking out toward the balcony. He didn't turn when I entered. I didn't say anything either. The space between us wasn't charged anymore. It was heavier than that. It felt like consequence. Eventually, he spoke. I wasn't sure if you would come. I wasn't either. He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the horizon. We could go, he said, like I said last night. Just a day. No questions. But there would be questions, even if they weren't spoken aloud. I sat down in the armchair near the wall, curling my legs beneath me. My chest was tight. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Some answer, some sign, something that would make this feel less like a fall and more like a choice. He leaned back, finally looking at me. I'm not trying to steal anything, he said quietly. Not from him, not from you, I know, I interrupted, voice hoarse from disuse. But that doesn't make it simpler. Silence settled again, like dust. We didn't leave that day. We stayed in the inn, moving around each other like shadows, careful not to collide. He didn't reach for me. I didn't lean toward him. But every moment was laced with the memory of what had already happened, and the threat of what still might. That evening we drove back. The car ride was suffocating in its normalcy. The road was the same, the landscape unchanged, but everything else had shifted. I stared at the passing trees, wondering how something so massive could feel so invisible. I felt his gaze a few times in the rearview mirror, brief and quiet, like a question he was too tired to ask again. Back home, the house greeted us with its usual stillness. The familiar scent of wood polish and laundry soap, the clock ticking faintly in the hallway, the fridge humming in the kitchen. It was all intact, untouched, as if none of it had noticed we'd ever been away. I unpacked slowly, placing each item back in its place like a ritual. My husband had left a note on the kitchen table, a reminder to confirm a dinner reservation for the weekend, a line about calling his mother, a postscript that said he missed me. I stood there for a long time, fingers resting on the paper, reading the same words over and over. Upstairs, I heard movement. Footsteps across the floor, the sound of water running. He was settling back in, as if nothing had cracked open between us. That night, my husband returned home. The reunion was quiet. He hugged me from behind as I stood by the sink, his hands resting lightly on my waist, his mouth brushing my shoulder. There was warmth in the gesture, but not urgency, not hunger, just habit. Later, in bed, he turned to me. His hand found my hip again, a mirror of the morning before. He kissed my shoulder, his breath steady against my skin. I closed my eyes, waiting to feel something. Anything. I let it happen. The closeness, the familiar weight of his body, the rhythm I had memorized years ago. But I didn't feel him. I didn't feel myself. I was watching from a distance, my mind disconnected, my breath shallow. His hands moved across my skin like they were following a script, one we had both forgotten how to rewrite. When he fell asleep beside me, I turned toward the window, eyes wide open. Outside, the moon was high, silver and cold. Across the hall, in a room where he couldn't sleep either, someone else was staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was awake. And I was. I was painfully, unmistakably awake. The suitcase wasn't heavy. It lay half-zipped on the bed, a few items tossed inside without care. A dress, 2 folded tops, my softest jeans, a scarf I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't about what I packed. It was about the motion itself. The act of gathering, of moving, of pretending I had somewhere else to be. Somewhere that wasn't here. I didn't have a destination in mind. I wasn't running. I wasn't even leaving. Not yet. But I needed to feel what it was like to make a choice. To touch fabric and tell myself it would be worn elsewhere. That there was still time to decide what life I wanted to inhabit, even if only for a few hours. The house was still. My husband had gone to the office early. He didn't ask questions about the past few days. He moved through the house like someone retracing familiar steps, trusting the floor not to give way. We hadn't spoken of the inn, of the tension, of the silences thick enough to suffocate a room. We hadn't spoken of anything, really. He kissed my cheek, reminded me to water the basil, and left as if we were fine. As if nothing in the air had shifted. The suitcase remained open, like a question I was too afraid to answer. I sat beside it, fingers pressed to my temples, trying to quiet the hum in my chest. Every breath felt too loud, every heartbeat too pronounced. I kept thinking about the door, the front door, the way it would sound if I closed it behind me. If I carried the suitcase down the steps, into the car, and drove until the familiar blurred into something else. I didn't move. Around noon, I grabbed my bag and keys. I didn't say goodbye. There was no one to hear it. I drove with the windows down, letting the wind tear through my hair, trying to feel like someone who had agency, like someone who knew what she was doing. I ended up at the station, not for any real reason. It was an old train stop just outside the city, one of those places that still felt suspended in time. The walls were pale, slightly cracked. The bench out front was chipped along the edges. There was a vending machine humming lazily beside the door. It smelled like dust and pavement and faintly of oil from the nearby road. I sat for a while. No one recognized me. No one looked twice. I was just a woman with a neutral expression and an untidy ponytail, clutching a half-empty bottle of water and staring at the schedule board as if waiting for something to appear that didn't yet exist. I watched people come and go. Mothers with restless children, men in suits scrolling through emails, teenagers with headphones, bobbing their heads in sync with something private. They all had somewhere to be. I had nothing but time and the ache in my stomach that no longer felt like guilt, only confusion. Then I saw him. He stood across the lot, leaning against a lamppost like he belonged there. His hands were in his pockets, his head tilted slightly, his eyes already on me. He didn't look surprised. He didn't wave or call out. He just watched, the same quiet intensity that had followed me for weeks now resting calmly in his gaze. I stood slowly. My knees felt unreliable. My heart did too. He didn't move until I crossed halfway toward him. Then he stepped forward, careful, without assumption. We stood face to face, the space between us tight with things unsaid. I opened my mouth, but nothing came. He spoke first. "You didn't tell anyone where you were going?" I shook my head. "Did you know you'd see me here?" "No." He studied my face for a moment. There was no smile, no satisfaction. Just something restrained, something deeper than patience. "You didn't bring much?" he noted, glancing at the bag. "I didn't plan to stay anywhere," I said quietly. He nodded, thoughtful. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A train ticket. I didn't ask what it was for. I didn't have to. He held it out. "It leaves in an hour." "To where?" "A place I go when I don't want to be myself for a while." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because of what they meant, but because I understood them too well. I took the ticket. It felt heavy in my hand, even though it was just paper and ink. He stepped closer, still not touching. I'm not asking you to run away. I'm asking if you need to disappear, just for a little while. I looked at the platform. I could hear the train approaching already, faint and steady in the distance. It was early, or maybe time was playing tricks on me again. A breeze swept through the lot, lifting the edge of my scarf, sending a chill across my collarbone. He didn't reach out. He waited. I can't, I whispered. He didn't flinch. I know. We stood there for a while, neither of us moving. Eventually, he turned and walked toward the far end of the lot. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. I didn't get on the train. I waited until it left, the sound of it pulling away, tugging something loose inside me. Then I walked back to my car, sat behind the wheel, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. There was no dramatic realization, no burst of tears, just quiet. Quiet acceptance that the version of myself I had been until now no longer fit. And somewhere, not far from here, he knew that too. Coming home didn't feel like coming back. There was no relief, no regret, just a strange emptiness, like the road itself had scraped away everything I'd been thinking, leaving only a quiet shell behind. Rain had started to fall by the time I turned onto our street. Droplets rolled down the windshield, soft and slow, warping the shape of headlights and rooftops, turning everything familiar into something unrecognizable. At some point, I turned off the radio. Silence seemed more honest. The house greeted me with muted light and the scent of stale air. I opened a few windows, not because it was stuffy, but because I needed something real to move through the space, something that breathed. I left my bag by the door. I didn't unpack. I wasn't sure how long I'd stay, or if I was even supposed to be here anymore. He was still here. I didn't need to see him to know it. His car was parked on the street, and there were signs of him everywhere. Small, barely noticeable things. A jacket draped over the back of a chair. A coffee cup sitting on the windowsill. The creak of the stairs when he moved overhead. He hadn't left. Or maybe, like me, he was trying to figure out how to begin again. I didn't seek him out. But he found me. Late in the evening, after I came in from the balcony, he was standing in the kitchen doorway like he'd been waiting. His posture changed the moment he saw me. His shoulders lifted slightly, tension hiding just beneath the surface. But his face stayed calm. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because no words could hold what I was carrying inside me. "I didn't know," I said finally. I needed to leave just to understand there was nowhere else to go. He nodded. There was something in that gesture. Sorrow, understanding, maybe even forgiveness. He didn't move closer. He didn't ask for anything. And that restraint was the hardest part. The following days passed without drama. My husband returned from work with his usual rhythm of emails and phone calls and half-finished thoughts. He didn't mention the time I'd been gone. He asked nothing. If he felt something, he hid it well. Our conversations became shorter, purely functional. "Have you seen my blue shirt? Do we need more eggs? Are we still having dinner with the Martins on Saturday?" He didn't ask where I had gone. He didn't mention that anything had changed, and yet everything had. I began to see our home as a stage set from a life I used to inhabit. The chair where I once curled up to read, the table where we shared wine and lazy dinners, the bed where I used to sleep with my body curled into his. Everything was in its place, and none of it fit anymore. One evening, he came up behind me in the kitchen while I rinsed fruit at the sink. He rested a hand on my shoulder. It was a warm touch. Familiar, steady, nothing urgent, nothing intimate. It was a gesture that once would have comforted me. But my body didn't respond. Not in fear, not in disgust, just with absence. As if the connection had been gently but irrevocably severed. Later that night, we lay in bed, his arm around my waist. His hand found its usual place on my hip, and I let it. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean into it either. I closed my eyes, tried to recall what it once felt like to want this. To want him. The memory wouldn't come. When he fell asleep, I slipped out from under the covers, wrapped myself in a robe, and stepped out into the hallway. I didn't turn on the lights. The glow from the street lamp outside filtered in through the windows, casting faint lines across the walls. I sat on the couch in the dark. The house was silent, save for the ticking clock in the hall and the soft hum of the refrigerator. My chest felt tight, like something inside me was bracing for impact, even though nothing was moving. Half an hour passed, maybe more. Then I heard the stairs creak. He stood at the threshold of the living room, barely visible in the low light. He didn't speak. I didn't either. We both knew what was happening, what had already happened, and what could no longer be undone. "I can't stay," he said softly. I nodded. There was nothing else to say. I didn't ask where he would go. I didn't ask when. I didn't ask why. He left as quietly as he had arrived. And I stayed, alone in the room where I had once felt most alive. The house had returned to silence. Not the kind that breathes between words or waits for footsteps, but the kind that settles into the walls, heavy and unmoving. For the first few hours after he left, I wandered from room to room as if searching for evidence that he had been here at all. But his presence, though once so vivid, had always been quiet, like a breath on the back of the neck or the softest pressure against the air in the room. Now, even that was gone. The camera was the only thing he left behind. It stood on the small side table near the living room window, its strap coiled neatly beside it, the lens cap still on. I ran my fingers across the textured grip, then lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. He had carried it everywhere during his stay, always watching the light, always noticing the small things. I pressed the power button and the lens adjusted with a soft mechanical whir. The screen lit up. A gallery of images appeared. I hesitated before scrolling. The photographs weren't posed. They weren't even obvious. They were fragments. My fingers brushing the edge of a book, the curve of my shoulder in the kitchen light, the reflection of my face in the hallway mirror. He had captured me not as someone seen, but as someone observed, quietly, intimately. Not as a wife or a stepmother or a woman in conflict, but simply as I was when I thought no one was watching. I set the camera down slowly, more shaken by the tenderness in those frames than I'd expected. It was one thing to be looked at, another to be seen. Later, in the garden, I trimmed the herbs by the stone path. The sky was pale, overcast, but the air was warm. I dug my hands into the soil, pulling at weeds that hadn't been touched in weeks. Dirt caught beneath my fingernails and sweat gathered along my spine. There was something grounding in the rhythm of it. I wasn't sure if I was trying to care for the plants or just trying to feel like I still knew how to tend to something. Inside, the clock struck 5. My husband would be home soon. We hadn't spoken since that last quiet night. He hadn't asked about the empty guest room, and I hadn't volunteered anything. Our routines resumed as if on autopilot. Dishes washed, bills paid, sheets changed. A dance performed without music, without meaning. We were placeholders now. Roles filled by people too tired to rewrite the scene. When he came home, he brought groceries and a bottle of wine. He kissed my cheek, asked if I wanted to cook something together, and I said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because refusing would have required a different kind of truth, and I wasn't ready to speak it aloud. We chopped vegetables side by side. The rhythm of the knife hitting the board filled the silence. He told me about a colleague's promotion, about a new project at work, about the weather forecast. I nodded, added salt, stirred the sauce. He smiled at something I said. I don't remember what. And for a moment, I almost saw us. Not who we were now, but who we had once been. Before the silence, before the ache, before desire had found a different language. Later, we ate on the terrace. The wind was light, brushing against my arms, and the wine made my lips warm. We clinked glasses. We laughed softly at something small. From a distance, we must have looked like a couple at ease. Two people who had built something lasting. But I felt the fracture. Not sharp, not recent. Old, widened over time, and now too deep to cross. After dinner, he went upstairs to shower. I stayed behind to clear the plates. I moved slowly, washing each dish by hand, drying them carefully, placing them in the cupboard with deliberate attention. The glass I'd used earlier slipped slightly in my grip, and I steadied it, heart briefly lurching in my chest. I thought about how many moments in my life had passed like that. 1 second of imbalance, one flicker of risk, corrected before it could change anything. I dried my hands and stepped out onto the lawn. The grass was damp, cool beneath my feet. Above, the stars had begun to pierce the clouds, faint and uncertain. At the back of the garden, beneath the tree where he had once taken a photo of me laughing, real, unguarded, spontaneous. I stood still. I didn't cry. I didn't fall. I just stood there, letting the night hold me in its arms. The house was behind me. Familiar, structured, mine. But something inside me had already moved elsewhere. Not toward him, not toward a new life. Just away from what I had been pretending to live. Inside, the hallway light flickered. I turned, walked slowly back in, and closed the door behind me. I knew I would stay. For now. But nothing would be the same again.